Good evening. My name's Andrea Mandel. I'm Vice President of the West Windsor Township Council. I'd like to welcome the watershed here. We've been working with the watershed for probably 4 years now on looking at a regional approach for the Assunpink watershed as far as flooding and water quality. And this is a watershed evening, if you will, to have this start and to have us actually start this project with other municipalities. And we like to think that water doesn't know where the town boundary is. So a project like this, where we can look for projects to control water and to improve water quality that goes across municipal boundaries, is something that we're really looking forward to pursuing. And we're also looking at doing this in the Upper Millstone watershed, which is the next project. But this one's further along, and we're looking forward to having this actually happen. I know have been for a number of years, and I'd also like to introduce the mayor. I want to thank Mayor Marathi for supporting this. He's been very supportive of this regional approach for water quality and flooding, and the rest of the council has been very supportive. So I'd like to thank the council and our engineering department that's also been in on this from the beginning, in addition to the watershed. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilwoman Mandel, for that introduction. Really close? Thank you, Councilwoman Mandel, for that introduction, and thank you to West Windsor for offering to host this meeting. We're going to jump right in with the agenda for the meeting. So tonight we're going to cover some basics about watersheds and even basics about the Assunpink watershed specifically. We're going to cover what a watershed management plan is. Then we're going to hear from the consultants, Princeton Hydro, about the work they've been doing in the Assunpink watershed. We're going to then open the floor up for questions, as well as seek information from the public through a survey. And finally, we will discuss the watershed improvement plans and regional approaches.
Thank you, Jolynn. Good evening. My name is Mike Pissarro. I'm the Policy Director for the Watershed Institute. I want to, as Jolynn mentioned, thank West Windsor for hosting us, for their support over the years in this approach, and for all of our municipalities that have met with us over the last couple of years, suffered through multiple presentations and meetings to talk about this. And this is extremely exciting. So before I jump in, the Watershed Institute was lucky enough to receive a grant from the New Jersey DEP to do a watershed management plan. So, there's some differences, and we'll go into that, to study flooding and water pollution in the Assunpink. And so when we say the Assunpink watershed, we are talking about an area of land around the Assunpink and all of the tributaries that flow into the tributary and ultimately into the Assunpink and eventually out into the Delaware. So a watershed is just an area of land that we can sort of track all the drops of water that theoretically flow across that land and into the waterway. And I do want to mention before I go too far, we are recording this meeting. We are having it hybrid, so people are online virtually. We are recording it, and this presentation, the recording, will be available on our YouTube website. We will share it with the municipalities to provide links to everyone as well. So the Assunpink, that is the area in green that we are talking about tonight, is about 92.5 square miles. Its headwaters, or the beginning of the Assunpink, is in Millstone Township down in Monmouth County. And it flows through all of those municipalities into and discharge into Trenton in the Delaware River. Here are the towns that are in the Assunpink. Lots of them have formally joined this approach. There's a couple who have not formally joined, but Trenton, again, that's where the Assunpink ends and meets with the Delaware. Hamilton, Ewing, Robbinsville, Hopewell Township, Lawrence, West Windsor, where we are tonight, Upper Freehold, East Windsor, Roosevelt, and Millstone Township, where the Assunpink begins. And a little bit hard to see, but this is a color coding of the Assunpink in land use. Red is urban and green is forest, and you have wetlands, just to give you a sense of the land use. And that's important for our purposes. The more urban land use we have, the more volume of stormwater you have running off a site and into our waterways, more pollution. And when you have forest, you have much less of that. More of that water stays on site. And so, as I was just saying, the more impervious surface, the less or the more runoff you have. So in a natural condition, you have, I am not being able to see that, but you have 10% runoff. Time to change my glass prescription. But 10% of the water runs off the land and into our waterways. More of that goes into our ground, and either ground or deep aquifer, and some of that is used as evapotranspiration. As we put more and more impervious surfaces, so blacktops and driveways and homes and buildings, and even to a large extent our lawns, less of that water gets into the ground and more of that is in runoff. And more of that runoff is into our streams, carrying with it everything we've put on our land, whether we put that in there intentionally or unintentionally. Think about fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, brake dust and tire particles and everything that, our roofing tiles, all of that sort of ends up and runs off. And it cycles back and through. And that leads to more water, less ground for that water to percolate in, leads to flooding. We have the extreme storm on the left of Hurricane Ida, but you have just intense storms causing flooding, and that's becoming more and more prevalent today for multiple reasons, from more and more impervious cover in the watershed to more and more rain. Water pollution is a really big issue. And, if you look at our waterways today, you would think, they look clean. They are not from the 60s, where our waterways were on fire. Not being a scientist, I had to be told that was not the natural condition of water. But we've done a lot of good things from a water pollution perspective, but now we are in the hard part. Most of New Jersey's water pollution problems are because of how we manage our land. And the chart here, New Jersey DEP prepares a report every 2 years on the health of our streams. So this is from the last report that's available. And you can see that orange is not good. So most of our waterways are not healthy enough for the good macroinvertebrates, the bugs that are sensitive to pollution. Most of our waterways have some issues from primary recreation. And the Clean Water Act, which is a federal statute, and New Jersey's Water Pollution Control Act tells us and requires us to fix that. We should not have our waterways polluted. Our waterways should be healthy enough for the aquatic life and for us to go fishing and swimming and boating in. And in other presentations, I would show you charts from 2010, 2012, 2014. At best, we are sort of holding the line. At worst, our waters continue to degrade. So this is not just a one-off. This is a long-term trend. So with that brief description of watersheds and water pollution, I'm going to turn over to Princeton Hydro to talk about the actual watershed management plan, and then we will take some comments and questions.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to talk about an update to the Assunpink management plan. It worked. Okay. So my name is Tanya Dapke, and I'm joined by Michael Hartshorn and Chris Miko, who is joining us virtually, and we're the team from Princeton Hydro. So just so you understand a little bit more about us, Michael here has over 20 years of experience. He oversees organizational and project management for Princeton Hydro's aquatics department. He also has extensive experience in ecological restoration design and implementation, TMDL development, and watershed management. Chris Miko is a certified lake manager with nearly 3 decades of experience. He's been with Princeton Hydro for 27 years. His experience includes designing and implementing numerous watershed restoration initiatives funded by programs like EPA 319, which can involve structural BMPs, nutrient reduction techniques, TMDL development, and monitoring programs. And my name's Tanya Dapke. I'm a certified ecologist. I'm an entomologist. My background is in those macroinvertebrates that you were talking about, where we pick those out of the streams and we count them and we identify them. And I think that's the coolest part ever. So it's always a little bit sad when you have a strain where you don't have that. I'm new to the Princeton Hydro team, but I'm currently managing 2 other watershed management plans. So I'm pretty familiar with what's going on here. Princeton Hydro was established in 1998 as an ecological and engineering consulting firm. We have extensive experience in lake, river, and stream restoration and watershed management. So we're working with the Watershed Institute to develop a watershed management plan for the Assunpink watershed. This plan will utilize the EPA's 9-element approach. So in order to develop an effective management plan, we will be completing the above tasks that you see listed there in the bullets. These tasks also correlate with the requirements for the development of a watershed assessment report. We'll probably refer to this as a WAR in future slides for the New Jersey MS4 program. So we've already begun collecting water quality data, and we'll continue to do that through the spring and the summer of this year. We're also going to review historical data sets to evaluate flooding, erosion, and water quality impacts to the watershed. We'll evaluate trends and in those data and identify what kind of data is missing, if any at all. Modeling the watershed involves using those water quality metrics and inputting them into a model that will help us understand the magnitude of flooding and pollutant loading in the watershed. We'll be specifically looking at that water quality impairments identified in 303D and TMDLs, as well as flooding. And these data will be used along with the ground surveys to inform a selection of appropriate best management practices, or BMPs. Again, that's another acronym you'll probably see in other slides.
Tanya, let me just jump in very
Sure.
quickly because I didn't do my job. That chart I showed you from DEP water quality, that results in what's called a 303D list, what waters are impaired, and ultimately into a TMDL theoretically.
Theoretically.
But 303D is the list under the Clean Water Act saying our waters are impaired.
Correct. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you for the clarification. Stormwater engineers and ecologists will visually assess the watershed for areas of flooding, erosion, and nutrient transport and develop those BMPs. And then the BMPs will be assessed for removal of the target pollutants and flood reduction. So these results will be presented on a municipal level. So this is easily transfers to the WAR. But the best watershed plan involves the people who live there, the community itself. That's all of you out there. So please let us know what you've been experiencing in your neighborhoods and your backyards. There will be more meetings over the next year so we can continue to get feedback and coordinate with the Watershed Institute, stakeholders, and the municipalities themselves. And these meetings are vitally important because they provide us with context and priorities within each of the municipalities. Our meetings will occur before and after our watershed surveys, and we'll review those list of BMPs. And I believe, as was discussed in the agenda, the Watershed Institute is going to provide a way for you to provide some feedback. All this information will be used to develop the watershed management plan, which will provide recommendations for improving stormwater management and green infrastructure while increasing flood resilience and reducing climate change impacts. It's a lot of fancy words. I promise we'll explain everything. These data can therefore be used to directly inform the development of the WAR for each participating municipality. So what are the key points? The results of the watershed management plan can be used in that watershed assessment report. And we expect to have a draft form by September of this year. All the tasks that we're going to complete will be able to provide essential information for those New Jersey DEP MS4 requirements. Now I also have a fancy map. So this map is of the Assunpink watershed, as you'll see. And you can see some areas in yellow. I know it's probably hard to see, it's very far away, but these are those sub-watersheds, those smaller areas that fall into that 303D category. This means that the water body within those yellow sections are impaired in some way and that it needs to meet a TMDL. But just because a water body is impaired does not mean a TMDL has been developed. I know it's very confusing. So what are some of these impairments that we're seeing in those yellow spaces, and even outside of those spaces? There's multiple stressors here in the Assunpink. These include flooding and metrics that are at levels that negatively impact water quality. These include phosphorus, total suspended solids, turbidity, E. coli, metals like arsenic, mercury, lead, and even dissolved oxygen and pH. So some of these water bodies do have TMDLs, while others are going to be developed. So what is a TMDL? I keep saying this word. So in case you don't know what it is, it stands for total maximum daily load. It's a science-based path to restoring water quality. I recently attended the Watershed Institute's amazing conference this year, and one of the speakers there said that a TMDL is basically a pollution diet for the water body. So it really helped me put it into context, right? It's like a pollution budget for any kind of water body. It tells us the maximum amount of a pollutant, like bacteria, nutrients, mercury, sediments, that a water body can handle in a day while still staying clean and healthy. TMDLs exist to protect our water. So if a waterway is too polluted and it doesn't meet those federal water quality standards, a TMDL is created to guide the cleanup. TMDLs consider all sources of pollution, from pipes to stormwater runoff to everyday activities in our communities. And so you might be wondering who actually manages all this. In New Jersey, the New Jersey DEP leads that work, and they identify polluted waters, they study the problems, and they rate the TMDL plans. Then the EPA reviews it and they approve it. But the good news is that the residents don't need to fix or create any of these TMDLs, but your engagement does matter. So if it helps those who want to improve water quality to know where those problem areas are. Flooding is another really important issue. I'm sure some of you might experience this in your own neighborhoods. It's associated with major storm events, and it can really significantly affect those TMDLs. It increases runoff volumes, it mobilizes nutrients, sediments, and other pollutants that would otherwise remain stored in those soils and those stream beds. So it's important to assess the scope of flooding and the areas of concern so that we can prioritize flood risks that impact human health, property, and water quality. So one of the goals for this management plan is to ameliorate flooding using a regional approach with an emphasis on nature-based solutions. So just to give you an idea of what kind of TMDLs exist in the Assunpink, Miri Run has a phosphorus and an E. coli TMDL, while the Assunpink Creek at Peace Street in Trenton, so closer to the city, has an E. coli TMDL. So another part of what we're going to do is called a watershed survey. It's conducting a thorough evaluation, and a survey of the watershed is a critical step in identifying opportunities for improvement and for restoration. By assessing current conditions and identifying challenges and then developing targeted recommendations, we can help stakeholders prioritize actions and align them with available funding opportunities. This strategic approach helps guide effective implementation and ensures long-term success in restoring watershed health. So just as an example of how we do this, right? So we first conduct a desktop analysis and we review lots of maps of the watershed. Then we do a visual survey of the watershed. That's where we drive to all these different locations. We get out of our cars, we take pictures, we walk around the basins. We try and see, like, are they working effectively? Are they not working effectively? Because sometimes maps are outdated. So getting a visual assessment really helps us determine whether or not a best management practice can or should be implemented. So in one example here, you can see like a map. Hopefully you can see the map, it's very far away. But in that map, there's a section at the bottom that looks like there's some white lines that go into the in the green parts. It almost looks like one line with three forks, like a really weird fork. That's a retention basin. And those white lines are the canals that the water is being like pushed into. Basically, that's where they want the water to go. And next to it is a picture, like if you were standing in that parking lot and looking at that big field out, right? So it's important to have both of those views of those stormwater retention basins and how the water's being moved around the area. So our visual inspection not only reviews these locations for us that we've identified on the map, but it also highlights other areas that we may have missed when we were on that map. So when we drive around, we see someplace we're like, oh, that looks like it needs an improvement. And we'll stop and mark the location and write a little bit about it. Again, another important component of this assessment is input from local residents and the municipalities that manage these areas. Information about where flooding occurs and how severe it can be is best obtained from people in the communities that are directly experiencing these events. And that's all of you out there. Yeah, you go.
Hi, all. I'm Mike with Princeton Hydro. I really just wanted to kind of reiterate the value of that portion of the plan. We're going to be doing a lot of water quality monitoring and modeling and kind of scientific work to understand where these impairments are the worst and how they got that way. But really the value of the plan is, well, how do we fix the issue, right? And you have a lot of power approaching this regionally because we're looking at it as a watershed and not necessarily as a municipal boundary. So what we're going to be able to do is, number one, we need your help. We need your input. We want you to be involved from the beginning and throughout the process because you know best where it's flooding in your neighborhood, where you may see erosion. So we want you involved to help us identify the areas, help us prioritize them in terms of flood risk and erosion. And we're going to be collectively developing real life projects that fix the issue. And we have the opportunity here approaching it regionally to really focus also on like larger scale nature-based solutions, things like floodplain restoration or wetland creation that can really provide a lot of significant improvement to the Assunpink watershed. And the really cool part about this, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, is a lot of these component parts, especially the development of projects, identifying how much they may cost, what permits are needed, what funding sources are available. We'll be doing all of that. And a lot of those asks are also required for the MS4 process. So the goal is that municipalities can then use this information to directly transfer in their other realms and ultimately go for funding and make these projects come to a reality.
Thanks. So best management practices, or BMPs, they're strategies to reduce flooding, improve water quality by managing those stormwater and those pollutants more effectively. So what are some examples of this? Like that's a very nebulous word. So examples include replacing old culverts and existing infrastructure to reduce erosion, geese control, installing or updating stormwater treatment drains, and introducing filter media like biochar into water bodies, which can actually absorb those phosphorus, those high phosphorus levels that are a problem in some areas. High phosphorus can cause harmful algal blooms, and biochar is one of those new things that we're doing to help absorb that phosphorus. Green infrastructure BMPs can have impacts at a regional level, like Mike was saying. So these include riparian streambank stabilization, utilizing native plants, reconnecting the floodplain where possible, or creating floodplain wetland cells, as well as identification of flow plains. And that's just basically finding sites where stormwater can be directed to areas that are less vulnerable to flood damage. Yeah.
Can you just, what is a riparian zone? What is?
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
No.
A riparian zone is any of that area that's alongside a stream or a river. So what we found in Stroud Water Research Center and lots of science over the years has found that the more trees that you plant in between the water and the area surrounding that water reduces the amount of sediment, nutrients, metals, all those things that go directly into the water. So that riparian buffer, those trees, that vegetation helps to reduce that runoff. What was the other thing I need? A floodplain.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that one. I mean, if we think about it, like, the stream is not isolated. The stream and the function of the stream is related to what's going on in the watershed. So like, as Mike and Tanya talked about, when we start to develop the watershed and pave it over, we're getting much more surface runoff, a higher volume, and a flashier, quicker burst of water to the stream. That's transporting nutrients from the watershed, but that's also eroding the stream bank. And like if you go out into your local stream, you may say, wow, I'm like standing in it and the bank's at my shoulder. What happened? Well, we have this highly erosive flow because of our developed watershed and it's eroding the stream. So when that occurs, the stream's becoming disconnected from the land immediately adjacent to it, which is the floodplain. In a naturally functioning stream, when you have a storm, a lot of that high volume erosive water can jump the banks, spread out. And at that point, a lot of the pollutants can settle out there and not be transported to downstream water bodies. The issue is when we're developing our watersheds, the streams are becoming disconnected from the floodplains that land immediately adjacent to the stream. So we're losing that like critical functioning, both ecologically and hydraulically, where the water can spread out, slow down, and not flood your houses. So what we're going to look to do is identify areas and prioritize them where we can reconnect the stream to the floodplain to both assist with pollutant removal, but also for flood attenuation to minimize, flooding in your residential areas or your commercial districts.
Thank you. All right, so here's another very tiny graphic that you probably can't see. I do apologize. But in the middle, you see there's a person on a canoe. That's the waterway. And adjacent to it is the floodplain area, right? So these are the areas around that stream that Mike was just talking about that we could, that are the floodplain. We need to reconnect those two, the flow of the water between those two areas. So for this watershed management plan, we will be prioritizing larger scale, ecologically based restoration projects that can provide meaningful benefits at a regional level. Projects such as floodplain restoration and wetland creation can not only help slow and store floodwaters, but also remove nutrients and pollutants more efficiently while restoring valuable natural habitat. Taking a regional approach allows us to evaluate and implement these larger, more impactful solutions, which can lead to greater reductions in flooding and improved water quality overall. So for each BMP considered, like Mike has said already, we will be providing estimated costs, anticipated flood and pollutant reduction loads, and information on any required permits if there are any. And in addition, the BMP recommendations will be broken down by sub-watershed and municipality, making the information easy to use for local planning and for the watershed action report. Okay. So in November of 2025, Princeton Hydro staff went to 24 sites within the Assunpink watershed. At each site, a device was placed in the water to collect in situ data that includes like temperature and pH. And then discrete water samples were also taken to test for levels of nutrients like ammonia, nitrate, total phosphorus, E. coli, lead, mercury, and arsenic. So some of these metrics, right, like the E. coli and the phosphorus, they're important for us to note for those Assunpink watershed TMDLs. And the lab results show that some of these sites have a little bit impact, but remember, this is just a snapshot in time, like one moment in time where we took that water. And so we're going to be collecting again in the spring and again in the summer so that we can see if there's any of those trends in the watershed. All right, so what's next? Again, like I said, in the spring and the summer, we're going to be doing some water quality sampling. We're going to be doing that map and that visual watershed assessment. That's going to come up very soon. And the most important part is we need to have some input from you. Like, what are your concerns? Where does it flood in your neighborhood? What are the priorities in the municipality if you are one of those managers? It's only by working together that we can make a measurable impact.
So now we're going to open up the floor for any questions from the public who are in person, but also online. If you're in person, please come up to the mic at the front so people online can hear the question. And if you are virtual, please put your question in the chat or the Q&A option and they will be read aloud.
Is there anybody here from the council from Hamilton Township? No politicians or no council people.
Not that I'm
from
aware of.
Hamilton. and I'm guessing because they were not in the bold writing, I'm assuming they're one of the townships that are not participating in this. Is that correct?
So, somewhat complicated. So a little bit of background. We are doing what's called a watershed management plan, as you've heard. And so technically, we don't need any municipal involvement to do the watershed management plan. We thought it was important to involve the municipalities and, involve them, get their buy-in because of the component that we've sort of alluded to, but we will talk about in a little bit, the watershed assessment report, watershed improvement plans, and the MS4 permit. Hamilton Township had hired a consultant to do the watershed improvement plans and the MS4 stuff, and so did not want to participate in a regional approach for that at that time.
Now, do we have an individual here from DEP tonight?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
All right. I'm a resident in the Cornell Heights section of Hamilton Township. Now, I don't know if you folks had looked at Whitehead Mill Pond. All right, the Assunpink flows into Whitehead Mill Pond, and then it continues and goes through the city of Trenton and eventually ends up in the Delaware River. Okay. Back in 1989, I attended a meeting because whenever we get days of heavy rain and also major storms, what we do is we get flooded out. So the street that would be closest to the Assunpink Creek is Rutgers Avenue. The street that I'm on is Vetterline Avenue, and the street beyond me is Lehigh. So that Assunpink Creek goes over its banks, flows through the woods, floods out all the residents on both sides of the street on Rutgers, both sides of the street on Vetterline, and then on the street in Lehigh. So that's a pretty big span I'm referring to. So now, unless something, because we definitely do not need no additional water from a watershed flowing into the Assunpink, because the Assunpink cannot handle it, okay? And nothing's been done. Back in '89, I went to a meeting in Hamilton Township, and a councilman told me to put my house on stilts. And they said nothing's going to be done with Whitehead Mill Pond because they're afraid, because it's going to be too costly. They're afraid of the contamination that they're going to find, and also because of the endangered species that might be affected. So the only contamination that's going to be found in there, it's not from back in the day from good old rubber, because yes, I know people that worked at good old rubber. They dumped in the Assunpink, but they dumped downstream of the falls that were there. Okay, so the only people that's dumping in Whitehead Mill Pond would be the Ewing Lawrence Sewer Authority. Okay, and I've seen drums as a kid. I've walked through the woods and everything. There's drums and there's pits back there and everything. So that contamination is from them. So Whitehead Mill Pond, and I had found out there's 3 owners of that property. I don't know how it's split up, or I should say that body of water. One is Hamilton, one is Lawrence, and one is Ewing Lawrence Sewer Authority. So why aren't those people going to be responsible to clean that, to dredge it, restore it back to its original banks, okay? And then also go, because there's stagnants of water there that are not flowing, and it's overgrown by the years. And I had said that, if nothing gets done, that's the reason why we're getting flooding out, because this body of water cannot handle the water coming from the Assunpink. Now, can we go back to the slide from you, ma'am, where it showed the stressors on Assunpink? Go ahead, if you can find that on your thing. I'd like to bring that film up. That's footage up there. Keep going. That's that right there. That's the one I'm looking at. Okay, so what I feel we needed, I'm no engineer, but common sense, you have to restore. Before you dump any additional water into the Assunpink Creek, you got to restore that Whitehead Mill Pond back to its original banks. It's got to be dredged, because back in 1989, when I went in that body of water, I was up to my knees in silt and muck. Okay, so over the years, that has filled up and it's been a lot worse. So that has to be dredged. It has to be, and then the Assunpink Creek, which flows into our Whitehead Mill Pond. What they need to do is they need to build a culvert. If I think that's what you had said it was, they need to build that from the Whitehead Mill Pond and parallel that through the woods all along Rutgers Avenue and down into the woods, because that would prevent it from overflowing, because they had that culvert in behind Hamilton Avenue in Hamilton Township. And also, if anybody knows where the corner of Hamilton and Cooser Road is, if you go on Cooser, you'll see that culvert.
Mhm.
That's what we need. We need a wide, deep, and a cement wall to prevent that water from overflowing, because it's not the Delaware Raritan Canal that gets us, it's the Assunpink Creek that gets us each and every time. And to flow over 3 streets like that, that's absurd, and we get no help at all. And so what I feel we need here is we need a Superfund site to get that cleaned up. That's what we really need. It has to be cleaned up before you guys start dumping any more water from the watershed into the Assunpink. There's other areas that need attention as well, but we're one of the major areas that get affected every time it floods. So that's got to be taken into consideration, because if not, I'm totally against this. You can't dump no more water into that Assunpink Creek. Grasses have grown in there. There's been trees that have fallen down there, because the last time I took my boat from the Whitehead Mill Pond up along that Assunpink Creek, I only was able to get so far because of the overgrowth and the down trees and everything. So that has been narrowed down. That needs to be widened, dredged, and we need a culvert, just like the film showed, along there that parallel the street, which would be Rutgers, all the way down into the wooded area to hold and to maintain that water, because we're getting flooded out. And then also Carnegie Road, which is near Route 1, that gets flooded out. So we're strictly in a floodplain area. We never were, but then they reestablished us into the floodplain. So, before we do anything and dump any additional water into this, and then we had the crossings, which were built, they're townhouses and condos over there, where the former American Standard site was, all that storm water that gets drained into the Assunpink, because I saw them cut the road, put the pipes in, so that's all draining into the Assunpink. We're overwhelmed and inundated with water, and we have to do something. We just can't put a watershed in. We have to do something. Now, also, if you follow Business Route 1, and just before you where you go around the bend, just before you get to the Perry Street exit, there's a big green dumpster always there. There's always a crane, and they're always taking branches, logs, debris, and everything out of there. So I'm assuming it probably goes like this and down, or the other way. But what's going on over there? That's a congested area.
So
do you know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly. I know where you're talking about.
Yeah.
So let me be extremely clear on a few things.
Yes.
You are in a watershed. We're not creating one. It already exists, and it starts in in Millstone Township,
Right.
and discharges into Trenton.
Right.
So everything everyone does upstream of where you're talking about
Right.
may impact you. And what we are hoping to do with Princeton Hydro's help by studying the watershed
Right.
is figuring out where we can reduce volumes, where we can restore floodplains, where we can give opportunities for the volume upstream of Hamilton, Trenton, Ewing, and Lawrence. Because the one thing we learned, and this happened after Ida, is not one town can fix its flooding problems.
Right. And also we got really flooded out on Hurricane Irene.
Yep.
Not so much with Sandy, they hit the
Yep.
shore points, but Hurricane Irene devastated us
Yep.
once again. And we always get flooded. Nothing seems to be done. And once again,
So-
Hamilton Township and all the mayors and previous mayors, nothing's ever been done to resolve the flooding over there. So that's why I don't want to see no additional water going into the Assunpink.
So our plan is to reduce the amount of water that flows through the Assunpink and give it opportunities to reconnect with the floodplains so that we're not creating more flooding. And we're going to identify projects so the towns can implement. So where can we do riparian zone plantings? Where can we do floodplain reconnections? Where can we do wetlands creations where they are sponges and they absorb and they slow down the release and they clean it. Where can we put in rain gardens and porous pavement? So there's Princeton Hydro through this process, and this is the start of it. So I do appreciate your feedback, is what can we do? What can towns implement? And after this sort of comment or question period, we're going to talk separately about stormwater and the MS4 permit and those things. So I've heard you. I want to give an opportunity for anyone else that may have questions or
And
comments.
also too, across from the Whitehead Mill Pond, I keep referring
Yeah.
to that because that's
Yeah.
where I live. Across from that, across with Sweetbriar, that's the road, there's a area there with a wooded area there. And for the last couple of years, they wanted the Ewing Lawrence Sewer Authority wanted to buy that property and put up solar panels. And they wanted to have the solar panels 6 feet off the ground. And nobody at the meeting brought up the question, why would the solar panels have to be so high and why aren't they on the ground? Because we get over 3-4 feet of water over there. That's why they want to put the solar panels 6 feet off the ground. That's how much water we get. Cars get submerged under the water on Sweetbriar and Whitehead Road. So we're talking a big volume of water that's coming in over there and it's flooding out, and then it floods out the holding tanks over there at the Ewing Lawrence Sewer Authority. So now we have feces and everything else in our water. So when we have to clean our basements out, they have to be, they have to be sanitized and cleaned, and everything else have to be done. There's like a 3-step project for them to clean the block walls in our basements and everything because of everything.
I
Okay.
appreciate it.
You do it.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying is, we need help. We need help. We need it. And if the Hamilton Township doesn't want to do anything, then I feel Hamilton, Lawrence, and you also Ewing Lawrence Sewer Authority, which is also known as ELSA, they should be responsible for that Whitehead Mill Pond because they're the owners of that pond. And that's what I had found out. And like I said, but they've done nothing. And if any one of us had a pond on our property that looked as pathetic as that does, and with stagnant pools of water and everything, DEP and EPA would be knocking on our doors, fining us, because of the horrendous conditions that pond would look. So, like I said, so before we go into this watershed project and dumping more water in there, we got to alleviate a lot of
Again,
problems.
our plan is not to dump more water.
Right.
Our plan is to reduce volumes and make it cleaner.
Okay,
All right. I appreciate it.
right, because my property, my basement can only hold so much water, and then I'm done, and I lose everything.
Right.
Yeah, well, Hamilton doesn't do nothing for us, man. No, it never has. And I've been a resident over 60 years there. They've done nothing for us, and they don't intend to do nothing. All right, that's it.
Thank you. So, hi. We have 7 towns that are involved in the regional plan. Are those 7 towns, how many municipalities do we have in the Assunpink watershed?
All of those towns.
So there's 8, maybe including Hamilton.
Nine towns. I think I counted right. Involved or in the Assunpink.
I'm not counting here.
Sorry.
Okay.
I can't count.
I can't count either. Okay. So, and in this watershed management plan, how many towns are participating in the regional approach?
So the management plan is going to be developed for the entire Assunpink.
Right.
The towns that have, and I'll talk about it in the next stage, and I apologize for making this a little more complicated than it has to be.
I
But
think you
the
answered my question, Mike. So there are 11 towns in the Assunpink watershed.
Yes.
Now, there are a group of towns that are working together as a group in their watershed management plan, if you want to call it that. What would you call that? Group.
So the towns that I have in bold, and 2 towns really haven't given us a yes or no, have agreed to take the information that is being developed with the watershed management plan,
Right,
to then take it, and again, I'll talk about it in the next stage, the watershed improvement plan. And I realize that's confusing and
okay.
but these sound
So they're out of the 11 municipalities, 7 are working together. Okay. One of those that's not working in that would be Hamilton Township. Okay. There is, when we're talking about mercury, Mike, I think you know this. Yes, I'm reading this from AI. Yes, the Shabakov Creek has significant mercury problems, with studies consistently identifying medium to high levels of mercury and methyl mercury. I want to go down and talk briefly about the source. I think that, okay, so contaminant sources, are you aware of where that contaminant source is? Where it's believed to be? So that is contaminant sources. The main pollution sources are identified as historical contamination from the Twin Pines Airport, which I believe, is that Lawrenceville?
Hopewell and Lawrence.
Hopewell and Lawrence, which includes leaking petroleum and industrial fluid waste from buried tanks. So I'm guessing that some of the waste was generated by the aeronautic instrumentation. So that Creek needs to be looked at, but there's plenty of information on that. So
Yeah, so a couple things, site remediation is site remediation and not
Right.
necessarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, part of a watershed management plan. But I do believe there is a cleanup going on, at least at part of that site.
right.
They started working on that. I thought it was a house going in, but it looks like it is a investigation at least
Okay.
across
So that's
from the
great.
Mercer
I
Meadows.
mean, all these little pieces coming
Yeah.
together and feeding it. The other thing is the top. So I'm jumping around as I jump around here. Municipality, let's say on the uppermost part of the Assunpink watershed. What tap municipality, one or two municipalities are at the head of that at this point?
So if you're talking at the headwaters.
The headwaters, yeah.
So
that's
you're
fine.
talking Millstone Township, Roosevelt, are the headwaters. Roosevelt.
Roosevelt,
Yeah.
okay. So it's fair to say what happens in Roosevelt and Millstone doesn't always stay in. No.
Okay. That,
So as we work our way down and all the municipalities and on more impervious surface, or they get BS'd by builders or developers and don't comply. This is what we see with the gentleman who lives down on Cornell Avenue and that Cornell area. So it'd be great to it would be great to solve our problem by dredging out White Pond Lake, but unfortunately, that's not going to solve the problem of flooding in and of itself. It's got to obviously be a comprehensive watershed management plan. Finally, with that, is Princeton Hydro using any AI software to identify areas of concern? Let's say taking impervious surface. So on a annual or once every 2 years, running AI searches, topographical or land use searches on these maps. So I'm just taking one example as impervious surface.
I mean, we're typically, yeah, we're using GIS data to analyze the impervious area. So, that's making use of like state supplied impervious surface data layers and, also,
USGS lines.
yeah, USGS or NJDP land use land cover and like aerial imagery to evaluate, the percent impervious areas. And that information's used to kind of, number one, inform the model and the hydrology and the pollutant loading. So we understand the surface runoff aspect, but also to help kind of guide our efforts and prioritize where BMPs are going to go. Typically where you have more impervious area, you have more need for the BMPs.
So some of the hot spots or either hot spots or opportunities can provide information to for BMPs. And then you would of course, you would do a lot of ground truthing too.
Yeah, we'll be doing ground truthing and we want everyone's kind of input and participation for that because, like the gentleman before, you may know of a specific area that's flooding, that has flooded for decades and it hasn't been addressed. We want to know those areas so we can, help solve those issues.
Thank you.
Online.
Yes. How does the Lawrenceville Environmental Advisory Committee participate in the regional plan?
Good question. So
How does the Lawrenceville Environmental Advisory Committee, or any group, I'm guessing, participate in a regional plan?
So tonight is one of the first steps. I will say representatives of all of the towns you see listed have been attending regional meetings that the Watershed Institute has been pulling together over the last 3 years, I think it is. We started in, I think, September or October of 2022. And we will continue to have quarterly meetings where representatives of the towns can meet with us. This is one of the first public meetings we are having on the watershed management plan that is being created. We're going to do another one in Trenton. We'll talk a little more about how you can, again, after tonight, supply some more information. But I believe representatives of Lawrence EC have been participating for a number of years.
And we also have phosphorus is a TMDL. The source can be naturally occurring from natural decay. What are the potential methods of treating this contaminant from a stream?
Yeah, sure. I could take that one. This is Mike. So phosphorus is a naturally occurring element. It's critical for all human life. I mean, for our ATP and biological systems and so forth. The issues come when more phosphorus is coming into an aquatic system than it should. So, phosphorus is tightly bound to sediment particles in a terrestrial landscape. And when we have elevated flow from climate change, increased rainfall, increased surface runoff, that causes more erosion to the streams that transports phosphorus bound to those soil particles. Also, that erosive force from that water when it erodes stream banks causes a suspension of phosphorus. Phosphorus can also be in a dissolved state. So, for instance, if you put down lawn fertilizer that has phosphorus and it rains, or you don't pick up pet waste, all of that dissolved phosphorus goes into a stream. So what we're looking to do is really address like the source causes of that phosphorus loading, and that's by reducing the volume of water that goes to the stream and minimizing the amount of erosion and pollutant transport. And that's typically done through the stormwater BMPs. Specific BMPs depend on the situation. It might be a small rain garden at, like, say, a library site. It may be things like wetland creation to help serve as a sponge to slow that water down so it doesn't erode upland lands and then transport that phosphorus. But yes, phosphorus is naturally occurring. It's needed. The issue becomes when there's too much of it. That's when we have the harmful algal blooms, which result in impairments to the aquatic life and the use of the water body.
Thank you. My name is Terza Warman. I live in West Windsor. I am thrilled that you are undertaking this project. It is much, much needed. Probably everyone in this room, especially if they live in West Windsor, have driven through our flooded roads, whether they are at the train station or along Washington Road, Clarksville Road. This is a persistent problem. And frankly, I grew up on Long Island. It's frightening. I have been frightened picking up a child from, the train station where I have to pick them up, and literally the area is severely flooded. So with that said, you probably do know this. West Windsor is also the site for the largest pending warehouse application known as Bridgepoint West Windsor LLC. And I'm happy to send you information, Tanya. I appreciate you providing your email. It is pending. It is now on remand to DEP. The project was approved by the West Windsor Planning Board and the Town Council. Some of the folks are here tonight. It literally calls for the disturbance of more than 400 acres of land, an increase of more than 241 acres of impervious coverage. This is along Clarksville Road and includes 5.5 million square feet of building footprint coverage for 7 warehouses, 2,435 car parking spaces, 1,072 truck trailer parking spaces. So I raise that because you're here at a moment where this project is in litigation pending on remand to DEP, where one of the issues is, will the updated 2023 flood maps apply or the 1999 flood maps apply? This town council approved the imposition of the 1999 flood maps, which even then were outdated back in 2022. So my question is, are there situations where you come in, put together a watershed management plan and make a recommendation to a township about a project like this that is pending and I think relied on outdated rules?
So I'm going to take that one. In full disclosure to everyone in the room, the Watershed Institute did file an appeal of DEP's permits that Terza just referenced. So the Watershed Management Plan is going to take a look at the current state of the watershed and what is currently going on. It cannot necessarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, take a look at what may happen in the future. I will talk a little bit maybe when we talk about the watershed improvement plans, something like that, but it can only go with what is currently existing. And looking at what projects and what's going to happen. And if I don't touch it on the watershed improvement plans, come back to me because I will touch a little bit about that. But we're going to identify projects to fix the current problem. As the state continues to develop, and the state will continue to develop because it has to. We have property rights. People have a right to develop their property under certain circumstances and requirements and standards. The land use will continue to provide pollution and volume, and we will have to address that. We cannot, as much as an environmental advocate, I would like to say, let's stop all environmental degradation. Let's just stop it and avoid it. Everyone who owns a home, who wants to improve the home, would be very upset when I say you can't do that. So we have to just do it intelligently. And, the rules that exist today are light years better than what existed 30 years ago, 50 years ago. There were no stormwater rules 50 years ago. So, we are dealing with a smorgasbord of past decisions, current decisions, and they are not always equal. And so we will continue. And, in 5 years, we will have new standards. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm guessing based upon past history, we will constantly improve and deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions from the online world? Any more questions in the room? And I appreciate everyone's thoughts and comments. So,
Well, let me just see if I can dovetail into that last comment. Planning for the future. The amount of water that comes out of the sky and falls onto the ground has to go someplace. So in my simple mind, it seems like either it's going to run off or it's going to get back into the ground. It's much preferable to let it get back into the ground because that's where we get our water from and so forth. So if I'm planning a 1 million square foot warehouse here, shouldn't the requirement be that under a heavy rain condition, I am required to hold that water on my property in retention ponds, whatever, for a period of time until the main water event is passed, and then slowly let it get either back into the ground or into the waterway that it would have gone into originally. It just seems like, I know I'm oversimplifying it, but is that basically where we should be heading with this?
Funny you should say that. Because on January 20th, New Jersey DEP adopted a new set of regulations. You may have heard about it, the Resilient Environments and Landscapes Rule. There's a lot of misinformation about that rule from some parties. But one component of that rule changes the stormwater requirements. And up to now, I'll start. The new requirements will be, once they are put in place, is for all sites to retain on site and infiltrate or reuse about 1.25 inches of rain. So, might be a drop in the bucket, but it is again, a vast improvement than the rules that just came out 2 years before that. Also, as I mentioned, rules keep changing, and developments met rules that were in existence 20 years ago wouldn't meet current standards. 3 years ago, New Jersey redefined the storm events that we were getting, how much rain we were getting. So before, I think it was about 3 years ago, we were designing stormwater systems for rainfalls that had not existed for 20 or 30 years, because the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration hadn't updated the data set. We stopped collecting that data or using that data from 1999. So New Jersey DEP, in what was called the Inland Flood Protection Rule, said the storms that we are getting today are not the storms that we're actually designing for, because they don't exist anymore. So we should design our stormwater systems to deal with the storms of today, as well as the storms that we anticipate in having in 2100. So, because what we know, what we build today will likely be here in 50, 60, and 70 years. So might as well have the stormwater system be designed to handle that future. So that will help. But what DEP is calling the volumetric reduction standard is requiring all new and redeveloped sites to hold on site that 1.25 inches of rain, so that we are. So it's reducing, well, it's over the entire area. So it's going to reduce some of that volume. It's not going to solve it. And we will always have a storm that's going to overwhelm anything we could possibly design. Ida dumped 8 or 9 inches of rain in a very short period of time. August 5th, I think it was, or 6th of 2024. We got 7 or 8 inches of rain, which is what we call the 100-year storm. We got that not over 24 hours, which is how that storm is defined, but we got that in an hour or two. Nothing, and I'm going to go on a limb. I'm a lawyer, not an engineer, but it's going to be really hard to design for everything. But can we reduce? Can we absorb? Can we take some of it out? And that on-site retention standard is a huge step forward, which we had not had until January of this year. All right, you want to go to, well, we've sort of done public comment.
So,
Well, you know what, and let me. So we talked a little bit about stream banks being disconnected. That picture in the middle, excuse me, where you see the stream bank several feet above the stream and it's very steep. That's not natural. That's what we're talking about. You have erosion, you have streams that you have to have a lot more volume come through that stream before it can jump the bank and get into the floodplain. Some of our streams, you will see the top of it is further into the stream than the bottom. So you have like an inverted V. Again, not a natural condition. And so one of the things we are looking to do is how do we fix that? On the bottom left, that is a stormwater basin. You would never know it. Tanya talked about the concrete channels that sort of channel the stormwater through. That's at the bottom of that. These basins are supposed to drain within 72 hours. That I took that picture myself like a week after rain. It was not draining, and there's a concrete low flow channel covered in dirt and grass. It's not supposed to exist. We don't even do concrete low flow channels anymore. But if you see things like this, these are things that Princeton Hydro and ourselves and the towns want to know about. Do you see stormwater basins that when it rains, no water comes in? Do you see basins that never empty? Some of them are designed never to empty, but that's what we want to know.
So, in doing so, the Watershed Institute has created a survey, so you could leave comments on the issue. You could also tell us the location of the issue. The survey is at the QR code there. It's going to be throughout the presentation later. If you don't have a chance to take it now, there's also a handout up front with the QR code on it. This is what the survey will look like when you open up the QR code. You're going to select the type of issue, like the ones we talked about: flooding, stream bank erosion, non-functioning stormwater basins, or any other stormwater issues you are seeing in your municipality. If you select other, there's going to be a text box that appears so you could describe what the other is. And then the regional group you're going to select is Assunpink, so we know that it's coming from the Assunpink watershed. And then probably the most important is the location of the issue. So there is a map in the survey. When you click on the map, you can either allow it to use your location, or you can put in the address of the issue. There is also options to put in comments and pictures of the issue if you have any pictures. Again, that's the QR code for the survey. Again, it's also on the handout up front. We will have this survey open up until April 28th. So that's about 3 weeks for you to leave any comments or any issues. And if you have any additional comments or questions, there's also an email we have set up. It's assunpinkwatershed@thewatershed.org. So you can email any additional things.
Yes, so if you leave this meeting and go, crap, I wish I had said X, Y, and Z, it floods at this roadway. If you want to, have questions, we had that email address. We're going to share all the information, all the data from the survey with Princeton Hydro, with the municipalities. This will help inform the development of the plan. I'm not going to speak for the municipalities, but if you know of a storm drain on your street that's clogged, you can identify that. That information we will share with the municipalities. They may not know it. And that might be something that can be easily fixed and reduce some flooding. I was at a planning board meeting many years ago where one of the members of the public was talking about concerns from flooding, and rightfully so. But he also said, this culvert is so clogged that every time it drizzles, it floods the road. The municipal engineer didn't know that. So, this was information that was shared that could have led to some improvements. So please, we're going to, as Jolynn mentioned, keep this open for until April 28th so we can collect the information. Your municipalities know a lot. We will develop a lot through GIS and others, but you live here, you live in the watershed, you travel the roads that get flooded with a half-inch of rain, an inch of rain, or whatever. All right. So the grant the Watershed Institute got was to develop a watershed management plan. And that's why we talked about a watershed management plan. And that is, if I didn't say this, it's a creature of federal law. It's been around for decades, and it's used to understand watersheds. New Jersey recently created something called watershed improvement plans. And Tanya referred to them a little bit. And so this is a regulatory requirement that watershed management plans really can't deal with. It's complicated. And part of this is watershed improvement plans. And so every town has what's called the Municipal Separate Storm Source System Permit, MS4, because that's a lot easier to say. It is the permit all municipalities have to control stormwater, regulate stormwater, and address it. And New Jersey is frankly behind the curve from many other places in the country, came up with this plan, watershed improvement plans. How do I actually address the water pollution problem that we know is mostly land use at this point? Not completely, but mostly. How do we address those total maximum daily loads? Because the law says if I have a TMDL, I have to implement those improvements. But New Jersey with this MS4 permit has now brought us into alignment for the rest of the country. If you've ever heard of the Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, where 5 or 6 states are actually working together to improve the Chesapeake Bay, this is the Jersey version. And why most municipalities will really work hard at this, how to reduce flooding. And again, I have my favorite chart. That's the Integrated Water Quality Assessment Report. That is the health of our watershed. And so TMDLs, Tanya and Mike went through this, but it will say how much pollution can go into the waterway, and it will allocate that diet to the various sources. And, the chart for the Assunpink wasn't as good as the one we have for the Stony Brook, so I'm using the one in the Stony Brook. It allocates how much of a reduction from stormwater, from municipal stormwater has to happen. And we are legally obligated to meet those reductions. But the question is, 11 towns, and I forget how much of a reduction in phosphorus is required, but you have a 22%. You have to reduce it. But if 11 towns are contributing to that problem, how do you allocate that 22%? Is every town responsible for 22? And I have no idea why it keeps advancing by itself. I think someone did something to the slides on it. Anyway, how do you do that? And so the towns realized it makes most sense to work together and figure out those allocations versus having 11 plans that aren't consistent with each other. Because if you have 11 plans that aren't consistent with each other, and you have projects all based upon 11 plans that are inconsistent with each other, do you think those projects will actually lead to the improvement? Or do you think we've picked the most expensive, least effective way to not get anywhere? For the teachers in the room, if there are any, it's like assigning a group project and none of the group members talk to each other. Probably not going to get a good grade. So these 11 towns saw the light, and I'm internally grateful for that, or a good chunk of the 11 towns did, that we should work together. So we're going to develop a plan that is consistent and that will get us there. And so the watershed improvement plan is in 3 stages. The watershed inventory, which was due at the end of December, January 1st. The watershed assessment report, which is due at the end of this year. And so this is the part that is really what Tanya and Michael all talked to you about, the watershed management plan. It's all the technical details, all the information, all the understanding of the watershed, which will feed into this second stage, the watershed assessment report, or WAR. And then we will have a hearing. We will have a meeting like this on that draft plan, get feedback on it, and then that will lead into the inventory report, which is due at the end of next year, which is at the end of this permit cycle. The permits for 5 years, it came out in 2023. We'll have a new one on January 1st, 2028. The inventory report is a lot of data that is going to be very useful to develop the watershed management plan. Where are your outfalls? So where does all your stormwater go and what streams? What are the drainage areas? So what are the little mini watersheds for each of those outfalls? What are the pipes? Where are the inlets? Where's your entire stormwater system? Where does it connect to other towns? I'm sure there's a timing on this. So all that information, the TMDLs, everything, where are your overburdened communities? Where is your impervious area? All of that's going to come into the plan. And now let me talk about impervious area for 1 second, because here's sort of kind of tricky. We use whatever the most recent data set is. And it may be 2020, I think, is the most recent GIS data set. If you look around the area, there's a lot of development that has happened since 2020 that may not show up on the maps. And we'll have to deal with that and figure out how that plays in. I saw one of the inventory reports that completely ignored a ton of development that was actually happening, but the data set predated it. We are always looking in the past. And so it's imperfect. You may have approvals, but never actually see shovels in the ground. So it's an imperfect world. But with data, you're always kind of looking behind. We did have the opportunity to get water quality monitoring going, which is a requirement of the watershed management plans, but not of the watershed improvement plans. But I just wanted to point that out because I got that question earlier this week. And then the watershed assessment report is where we are right now. So towns take all the information. Princeton Hydro is going to take all that information. They're going to do what they talked about and develop a draft plan. What are we going to do to improve water quality? What are we going to do to meet those TMDL reductions? How are we going to allocate all that between the towns? Where are we going to get the money? Identify potential sources of money, because this is going to cost money. It took us decades, if not centuries, to get here. We're not going to rain garden our way out of it tomorrow. It's going to take time and it's going to take money. We're going to have a schedule, a proposed schedule when we work with the municipalities. Here are the projects. Here's where, when those projects we anticipate doing, assuming everything goes perfectly, we get the permits and everything works. Again, we're going to have an information session on this plan. We're going to get comments. And then we take all those comments. That plan then gets revised, if appropriate. Address those comments. Again, how are we going to meet the TMDLs? How are we going to do impairments? How are we going to benefit overburdened communities? How are we going to do this? And again, revising that implementation schedule. That plan gets finalized next year and submitted to the DEP. And then sometime in 2028 and for the years thereafter, we will be implementing that plan. Municipalities, we will be doing plans. As Tanya and Mike talked about, hopefully we are doing more of the restoration. How do we restore our riparian zones, which are filters and buffers and absorbing of water and slowing it down? How do we recreate and enhance our wetlands? How do we reconnect our floodplains? Because that's where we believe we get our biggest bang from our buck. And we're going to, because we now have multiple municipalities participating, where are the projects that meet the most sense? Where can I do the most good for the least cost? And that might be West Windsor participating and doing a project in Millstone and helping pay for it, because they could get an increased reduction in volume cheaper by doing something in Millstone because the soils are better than if West Windsor did it. Think about Trenton, largely built, large amounts of pervious cover. How do you remove a lot of impervious cover to do it? That might be very expensive. But again, if I can contribute to projects upstream that have a better benefit, this gives opportunities so that we are reducing the cost from municipalities and getting a huge benefit. And so we talked a lot about in the beginning, the watershed management plan. I've always looked at the watershed improvement plans as watershed management plan light. We took a management plan, we sort of pared it down a bit and called it a watershed improvement plan. But much of what is being done for the watershed management plan is going to be useful and translate to the development of the watershed assessment report. And the watershed management plan, again, will be provided to the municipalities to use. And so Tanya mentioned there's the 9-element EPA standard. All of the information that we have highlighted is actually what we have to do for watershed improvement. You know, we are doing water quality monitoring, as Tanya and Mike mentioned earlier. That's not required by the watershed improvement plan, it is by the management plan. It's a little bit extra, but actually brings us more current with the data, so we have a better understanding of what's happening right now. So just to sort of tie the two things, you know, the grant we received is for watershed management plan, so that's what we have to do. But it, again, most, if not all of the information needed by the towns will be in that plan. There are watershed management plans throughout the state. Mercer County has several of them, so they exist. We will obviously take that information and use that where appropriate. And, you know, we're encouraging all towns and all regions to do that as well. Because why duplicate work when you don't have to? Why not use the information you have? And to the gentleman from Hamilton, you know, so the watershed assessment report, it's due this year. Hamilton actually has prepared their own report and released it last year. They were way ahead of schedule. So there is a plan out there. You can find it on the township's website and look at it. But it's there. And, you know, as I mentioned, we talked about the regional approach. Towns have agreed to look at this on a regional. We were, you know, able to get the funding to sort of do it. But again, if I have 11 towns doing 11 different studies and they're inconsistent with each other, towns have wasted money. And DEP will tell towns, if I had 11 plans that were inconsistent with each other, DEP will tell the towns, go back. Why are you all not agreeing? It's a one water. Water flows from one town to the next. Figure it out. So by doing this, we're saving money because we're going to be consistent. We have the opportunity to do regional approaches, which will potentially save money because we're doing bigger projects. And DEP has said, when grant funding is available, projects that are based upon regional plans will be looked at more favorably. So we are a leg up. And I think that is a vast benefit to that as well. Plus, we've brought people from multiple municipalities to talk with each other and to understand what's going on in their neck of the woods. And many times that doesn't happen. People from Millstone and Roosevelt are hearing what's happening in Hamilton and Ewing and Trenton, and vice versa. So I think that's a win in and of itself. Shameless plug, the Watershed Institute, you know, and I didn't do this, and I'm a horrible promoter of the Watershed Institute. Who knows what the Watershed Institute is? So we are a nonprofit watershed group. We're located at Hopewell Township, but we work in 30 towns in the Stony Brook, Millstone, and Assunpink watersheds. We work with municipalities. We work with community members. We also do a lot of work on a state level advocacy, legislation, and regulation to improve our health. We have a phenomenal, and I will deny ever saying that, even though this is recorded, we have a phenomenal education department with preschool programs and homeschool programs and summer camp. We're in Hopewell. We have 950 acres. If you have not come and seen us and walked the trails, please do that. But we also do technical Friday webinars, understanding more details. We have one coming up on this Friday. I mentioned the resilient environments and landscapes rule and the improvement from a stormwater perspective. But there's a lot of misinformation on that rule. We have a webinar on Friday at noon to understand the rule, the impacts, what municipalities will have to do. So they will have to revise their stormwater control ordinance to update it for the resilient environments and landscapes rule. If you want to know about that, that's this Friday. You can register. It's free. And then we have one, we talked a lot about restoration, floodplains, and reconnections. There's a company that is doing work in Pennsylvania to meet Pennsylvania stormwater requirements. They're doing wetlands restoration. They are having a significant benefit at a reduced cost. They think they saved Pennsylvania DOT $40 million over what had they done it rain garden by biobasin over that. And so Mark Gallagher from Princeton Hydro, as well as representatives of RES, will be talking about their experiences. Because we hope that towns in this plan and other plans look more to nature-based solutions, more to restoration than porous pavement and rain gardens. Not that those won't be important. And I just want to very quickly, before we open it back up. Oh, actually, no, I passed it. Sorry. That stream bank that we talked about, where is that? That stream bank we talked about, I showed a picture. So as we dump more and more water into our streams, that erodes the bank. That's a huge source of pollution. The stream is providing its own pollution. So we could do everything we want to fix the pollution running off the land, but we don't deal with the volume and we don't make the streams closer to what they were in a natural condition. We'll be back here in 10 years going, we have to do more. So we're going to try to, as part of this watershed management plan, get to the source of the problem and fix it. So we're reducing volumes, we're reducing flows, we're providing opportunities for that water to go elsewhere in a safe way. Anything?
No, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we want to reduce the volume of water going into the stream and then also correct the stream bank impairments that have manifested over decades, where it's becoming like this feedback cycle where the stream is eroding itself and releasing all the pollutants that have accumulated there over the years. So, we're truly looking at this as a system and trying to restore it as a system. And we will be touching on the bioretention and the rain gardens up in the watershed on the landscape, but we also want to look at the nature-based solutions that are restoring the stream banks. So those ecosystem functions of mitigating the excessive volume of water by connecting the floodplains, it's going to just restore the whole system. And ultimately for the folks downstream, like the gentleman that spoke earlier, that's going to reduce the amount of water that's coming downstream and, flooding out the properties and so forth. So that's the goal.
And then finally, we have the QR code up there again. If you have any other comments, questions, or concerns, you can email the Assunpink Watershed at thewatershed.org. And then a recording of this meeting will also be available on the Watershed Institute's YouTube channel, and we'll also give the recording to all the municipalities so they could spread it as well.
Thank you all. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Recording.